Power does not ask for permission. It acts, and the world adjusts. Last night, in a move that felt less like diplomacy and more like a cinematic cutscene, Donald Trump authorized a night raid that removed Nicolas Maduro from the center of power. Within hours, analysts panicked. They warned of China marching on Taiwan, of Russia storming deeper into Ukraine, of a world suddenly unchained. That reaction misses the point. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have never waited for Washington's approval. They act when they sense weakness. They hesitate when they sense risk. And this raid sent a signal, not of recklessness, but of resolve, that the United States under this president will run enormous risks to protect its interests. If that idea unsettles you, stay with me. If it intrigues you, subscribe and keep watching. Because to understand what just happened, we first need to understand what kind of world we are actually living in, and why the old rules no longer apply. That story begins one step back. For decades, we were taught a comforting story, that the world was governed by rules, by norms, by permissions quietly granted or denied in back rooms. But that world is gone. What we are witnessing is not chaos, it is transition, a shift from a rules-based order to a power-based reality. In that reality, the central question is no longer legitimacy, it is credibility. Can you act, and will you? This is where Donald Trump breaks the mental models of traditional analysts. He does not seek consensus, he seeks leverage. He does not manage decline, he engineers shocks. The removal of Nicolas Maduro was not about Venezuela alone. It was about demonstrating a method where a single tactical strike can reorder incentives across continents. That is why the raid mattered far beyond Caracas. And that is why reactions from China and Russia matter less than the calculations now happening inside their war rooms. To see how we arrived here, we need to rewind the clock, back to the forces that hollowed out the old order and made this moment inevitable. The collapse did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, predictably. After the Cold War, the United States became the system, security guarantor, market of last resort, enforcer of norms it alone had the power to uphold. For a time, that arrangement worked. But over the years, enforcement weakened. Red lines blurred. Violations went unanswered. Russia tested the perimeter. China pushed incrementally outward. Smaller regimes learned the lesson. You could defy the system as long as you did it gradually and paid lip service to the rules. Nicolas Maduro was a product of that era, a ruler protected not by legitimacy, but by inertia, by diplomatic caution, by fear of instability. His survival depended on a shared assumption in Washington and Europe, that removing bad actors was riskier than tolerating them. But history moves in cycles, and when the cost of restraint exceeds the cost of action, the cycle breaks. That is the moment we are in now. The Venezuela raid did not come out of nowhere. It was the release of pressure that had been building for years. And once pressure is released, events accelerate, fast. The moment of release always looks sudden, but it is never accidental. The raid on Venezuela was that moment. A single night, a single target, and a shock that rippled outward faster than any press release could follow. For years, Nicolas Maduro sat inside a fortified illusion, protected by foreign intelligence services, by Russian weapons, by Chinese systems, by Cuban muscle. The assumption was simple: he was untouchable. Then, suddenly, he wasn't. And that is what made this a crisis. Not the violence, the meaning. Because power is not measured by how often you act. It is measured by whether others believe you can. This raid shattered a belief that had calcified across the global South, that American threats were rhetorical and American red lines negotiable. If you're trying to understand global politics today, This is the moment to pay attention. Moments like this reshape decades. But crises never end where they begin. Once the shock lands, the real story moves underground, into the systems, the incentives, the quiet mechanisms that turn one strike into many consequences. What looks impulsive on the surface is often surgical underneath. Trump's geopolitical instinct is not conquest, it is disruption. He looks for the weak joint in a system, the point where pressure is cheapest and leverage is highest. In Venezuela, that joint was energy. Oil is not just fuel, it is liquidity, it is loyalty, it is regime survival. By removing Maduro, the United States didn't just change a leader, it rewired a network. Suddenly, American officials are in Caracas, US companies are preparing to revive Venezuelan oil production, and millions of barrels are poised to re-enter global markets. That single shift alters calculations everywhere. Energy prices fall, authoritarian budgets tighten, subsidized alliances begin to crack. This is Trump's method, a tactical blow that creates strategic gravity. Others must now move around it, react to it, adapt to it. And when systems are forced to adapt quickly, they expose their next vulnerability. Which brings us to the second shock. Because the consequences of Venezuela did not stay in Venezuela, they spread. The second shock arrived quietly, not with helicopters, not with explosions, but with numbers. As Venezuelan oil prepared to surge back into global markets, the pressure shifted elsewhere. On energy-dependent regimes, on exporters whose power rises and falls with the price of fuel. No country felt this more sharply than Russia. Already trapped in the grinding war in Ukraine, already strained by sanctions, Moscow suddenly faced a new variable it could not control. Falling energy prices don't just hurt revenues, they limit options, they shrink time horizons. And here is the deeper crisis. Western sanctions hardened, but simultaneously, Trump worked to push energy costs down. That combination is not accidental. It is coercion by market forces. Russia says little, does nothing, not because it is unaffected, but because reacting would reveal weakness. This is the second mini-crisis, a slow squeeze, invisible to headlines, devastating to strategy. And when pressure mounts silently, it doesn't explode outward, it collapses inward. Which means the real impact is not on governments first, it's on people. And this is where it reaches you, not in Caracas, not in Moscow, but in your daily life. Because geopolitics is not abstract. It shows up as prices, as uncertainty, as the quiet anxiety of a world that feels unstable. When oil floods the market, fuel gets cheaper, inflation eases, budgets breathe. But for millions living under regimes built on energy rents, the opposite happens. Subsidies shrink, services fail, power outages spread. In Cuba, the lights begin to go out, factories stall, transportation freezes. In Latin America, strong men hesitate, political prisoners are released, celebrations are cancelled. Fear travels faster than armies. If you live in a democracy, you feel this as relief mixed with unease. Relief that pressure works. Unease that the world is being reshaped without warning. This is the human cost of strategic shocks. They save lives in one place, they destabilize others elsewhere. If this perspective helps you see the world more clearly, stay with me. Share this. This shock didn't stop at borders. It went global. The ripple crossed oceans and exposed hierarchies. In China, the loss was not symbolic. It was material. 800,000 barrels a day of discounted oil, gone. A strategic foothold in Latin America, gone. What had once been called China's $100 billion gamble on Venezuela collapsed overnight. More unsettling was what surrounded that loss. Chinese military technology, air defense systems, neutralized with alarming ease. For Xi Jinping, this is not about Venezuela. It is about vulnerability. When Beijing calculates the cost of moving on Taiwan, it now has to account for something new, that the Chinese mainland itself may not be as insulated as once believed. In Iran, the signal landed differently. Venezuela had been a safe playground for proxies, for Hezbollah. That playground is closed. As protests surge at home, Iran's rulers are watching what happens when an isolated strongman falls suddenly. Even the protesters noticed. They renamed streets. And then there was Europe, watching, complaining, irrelevant. The old world muttered about international law while quietly asking about unpaid energy debts. Power had moved on, and Europe was still debating rules. Which leaves one final piece, the most complicated one, Russia. When moments like this pass, the future does not unfold in a straight line. It branches. From here, three paths emerge. The first is stabilization. Energy prices stay low. Authoritarian budgets tighten. Pressure replaces force. Russia, squeezed by markets and sanctions, accepts a negotiated end to the war in Ukraine. China slows, calculates, waits. Power resets without a wider conflict. The second path is managed tension. No peace, no collapse. China adapts by deepening self-reliance. Russia leans harder into China, despite the cost. Regional strongmen survive, but weaker, more cautious. The world becomes colder, sharper, but still contained. Then there is the third path, escalation. Shocks breed miscalculation. Leaders mistake resolve for overreach. This is the risk of tactical power. It compresses timelines. It forces decisions. Which path we take depends less on rules and more on judgment. This is the illusion we are finally shedding, that order is permanent, that stability is the default. It never was. Order is enforced. Stability is managed. The raid in Venezuela was not about ideology. It was not about morality. It was about reminding the world that systems respond to forceful inputs. Trump is not the cause of this era. He is its expression. If you want to navigate what comes next, you need a new map. Subscribe, stay with me, because the next chapter is already unfolding.